So we have the LULAC, we have the plan of San Diego, we have immigration, we have the Del Rio ISD. Salvatierra is going to push for this, basically the school to integrate, to keep Mexican and white students together. So instead of just building a new structure or adding on to the existing Mexican school structure, combine the structures. That way you have equal footing and equal facilities. So the Del Rio ISD had a plan to say, well, we're not going to build a whole new structure and we're not going to integrate. What we're going to do instead is just add 3 rooms to the existing 2-room wooden structure. So Salvatierra and others get LULAC. A lot of the founding members of LULAC were attorneys, very reputable attorneys, some of them very wealthy attorneys. We'll mention a couple of them in a few minutes. They take up this case and they argue that Salvatierra, the Mexican students, were being segregated, illegally discriminated based upon this decision to just add on to the existing structure instead of integrating the schools and providing equal facilities. And again, this is the claim that Mexicans are being segregated and it would be illegal to segregate white people from white people. That's going to be the contention. But we win this case, or LULAC wins this case on the lower level. But on appeal, Texas overturns the ruling, and Del Rio was able to keep the schools segregated. LULAC tries to get the United States Supreme Court to take up this case, but the United States Supreme Court refuses to do so. So we have a little success at the beginning, but then it's overturned, and the Supreme Court doesn't listen to it. But that's going to be kind of the start of LULAC pushing for civil rights opportunities and equality for Mexicans in the late 1920s, early 1930s. We'll have some other court cases that they'll be involved in later on too that'll be more significant. But that's going to be their start. Now we'll mention Ucapawa. Ucapawa is the United Cannery, Agricultural, Packing, and Allied Workers of America. So this is going to be a very long name. The main person you'd want to know from Ucapawa was a woman named Luisa Moreno. Luisa Moreno is this woman that's depicted down here. She was originally from Guatemala. She moved to Mexico as a teenager. When she was around 20 or 21 years old, she moved to New York City. So she goes from Guatemala to Mexico to the United States when she was around 20 years old. While in New York City, she worked as a sewing machine operator, and this is basically like a sweatshop, right? Sewing machine operators will work in these unventilated rooms, real stuffy, hot, everybody working side by side, and you just work these long hours with very little pay. So Moreno works in this industry, and she starts fighting for workers' rights, better conditions, better pay, and so forth. This is going to be mainly women that are going to be organizing under Moreno's leadership in the mid-1930s, and they have some successes. Because of her leadership abilities, she is then recruited by the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO. We talked about the CIO earlier on. The CIO was created during the Great Depression. The CIO will then recruit Moreno to head up Ucapawa, United Cannery, Agricultural, Packing, and Allied Workers of America. So Moreno will go to the Southwest. This is mainly going to represent people who work in packing and canning vegetables and fruits, right? So basically you have all these migrant farmers, mostly migrant farmers going out and picking, the peaches, oranges, apples, whatever they're picking, and then somebody's going to pack them or put them in cans. And it's mostly going to be women. So this will be mainly women. In fact, by the time we get to the late 1930s, Ucapawa will have about over 120,000 members. This is led by Moreno. So Moreno leads Ucapawa. The organization has over 120,000 members, and the majority of those members are women. So we're going to be, so Moreno is representing both women's rights in labor and the rights of Latin Americans, mainly Mexican Americans, in the southwestern United States primarily. Now, again, Moreno was from Guatemala originally. When we get to the 1930s and 1940s, and you're talking about labor rights organizations. Labor rights organizations in the 1930s and 1940s oftentimes had communist ties, especially if they were geared towards marginalized communities, African Americans, Mexican Americans, and so forth. So basically, Moreno has ties to communism, not necessarily because she's a big old Marxist, but mainly because communists believe in the equality of all workers, and workers' rights and workers' power. So she has ties to communism. She was born outside the United States, which means when we get to the 1950 McCarran Internal Security Act, because Moreno was not born in the United States, she was an immigrant with communist ties, she would be deported. So she winds up getting kicked out of the United States in 1950 because of her communist ties. Now, before she gets kicked out of the United States, Moreno will recruit a woman in San Antonio, Texas, named Emma Tenayuca. Emma Tenayuca is this woman right over here, and she's pictured with her husband at the time, a man named Homer Brooks. Now, Emma Tenayuca was born and raised in San Antonio. She was born in 1916. She was raised there. If you know the San Antonio, Texas very well, she went to Brackenridge High School. Brackenridge later became Wheatley. It's Brackenridge again. Brackenridge is just south of the downtown area, southwest of the downtown area. So Tenayuca went to high school in San Antonio, became very actively involved in labor rights organizing while she was in high school. In fact, she was arrested for some labor rights organizing when she was a teenager. Again, she was born in 1916, grew up pretty close to my grandmother. My grandmother was also in the vicinity, born in 1917. We're going to talk about another guy named Henry B. Gonzalez in a little bit that was born in 1916 also in San Antonio. So we're going to have some San Antonio ties here. So Tenayuca was actively involved in labor rights organizing, and she is selected and recruited by Moreno and Ucapawa to head up this Workers' Alliance of America. Now, Tenayuca also had communist ties. In fact, her husband, Homer Brooks, ran for governor in the Communist Party, I believe in 1936, if I'm not mistaken. I think it was 36. So her husband was the Communist Party gubernatorial candidate, I believe in 1936. They'll get divorced a few years later. But when we get up to 1938, Tenayuca is now leading the Workers' Alliance of America, and we're going to look at the pecan shelling business. Now, pecan shellers, or we'll just say this, San Antonio was really the center for pecan shelling in the country. Around half of all the pecans shelled in the United States were shelled in San Antonio, Texas. We're talking about like 400 plus pecan shelling factories in San Antonio, mostly on the southwest and west part of town. The southwest and west part of town was the part of town historically where the Mexican population has been its densest. So we have a lot of Mexican Americans working as pecan shellers in the 1930s. They are paid per pecan shelled, and they're paid different as to whether or not they get the full pecan shelled or if it's like broken pieces. You get paid more for full pieces. Now, again, they are working in closed, cramped conditions. Oftentimes, the buildings did not have running water or bathrooms. You'd have to go outside like an outhouse. You'd have cracking these pecans by hand, and then you're going to see a lot of like pecan dust and debris that's going to cause respiratory problems. Tuberculosis was already bad in San Antonio in the 1920s and 1930s. This will just make it worse. Asthma, if you have asthma conditions, all that pecan dust is also going to be bad for you. So pecan shelling isn't necessarily something you'd think of as dangerous, but in actuality, it was really bad for your respiratory system and your cardiovascular system. So, so these pecan shellers were making like $2 to $3 per week. They'd work like 50 hours a week, and they'd make between $2 and $3 per week. So we have a very low wages. Now, keep in mind, this is during the Great Depression. When we talked about the Great Depression earlier on, we said that the median household income at that point is probably around $700 or $800, maybe $1,000, depending on the year. So that $3 a week is not going to be anywhere near the median household income, right? It's starvation wages, very long hours. So they were getting paid like $2 to $3 per week. And as a result of dropping prices of pecans, the owner of the Southern Pecan Shelling Company, a guy named Julius Seligman, you don't have to worry about Seligman's name. Julius Seligman announced a 20% pay cut to pecan shellers. So they're already making like $2 or $3 a week, and now he wants to give them a pay cut. So, of course, they wanted more wages, not less wages, especially for the hours that they put in and the amount of money that they're making in profit per year. So Tenayuca leads this walkout. Altogether, we're going to have around 12,000 pecan shellers walk out of their jobs in South Texas, most of them in San Antonio. So she leads this massive walkout. They'll leave in late January. They'll be out for a couple of months. And ultimately, by March of 1938, the strike will be effective in giving pecan shellers a pay raise instead of a pay cut. Now, the raise is like 1 cent per pound of nuts cracked pay increase. So it wasn't a huge increase. And in fact, by the end of the year, this pecan sheller strike winds up not really mattering too much. So it is a victory, right? And she does represent mainly Mexican women, from what I'm told. My grandmother was involved in this as well. Again, my grandmother was pecan shelling in the late 1930s. And she was born in 1917. This was something that was passed down to me from my aunt Martha, who I just wrote a letter to just a few days ago, actually. So Emma Tenayuca leads this. It winds up being successful, but by the end of 1938, Congress passed the Fair Labor Standards Act. The Fair Labor Standards Act established that national minimum wage that we talked about during the Great Depression of 25 cents per hour. Now that sounds good that you have this pay increase of 25 cents per hour, and if you're working, let's say, 40 hours a week, because you also have a 40-hour work week put in place, then you're talking about making, what is that, $10 per week versus maybe $3 a week. So that sounds good in theory. The problem is it becomes too expensive to start for the owner's prerogative. So he decides to, within the next 3 years, mechanize the pecan shelling industry and get rid of individual pecan shellers. So within 3 years, most of those pecan shellers are out of work because of the Fair Labor Standards Act. And because of the, I guess you might call it corporate greed. It wasn't really corporation, but say corporate greed would also play a role. Can't just blame the government for that. Now I'll move on to the American GI Forum. Now, let's see. I'm going to play a video to introduce the American GI Forum. I'll come back to Hernandez versus Texas after that. But let me go ahead and share my screen, and I'll play this video for you. I'm going to try to time it so I can do both of my screens here. Over here. And let me share this. Oops. Soy de Texas, es mi orgullo ser chicano. En los barrios me pueden encontrar. In the
1960s, Mexican Americans made up the majority of the population of South Texas. Most were migrant farm workers, poor, with little education. After picking the winter crops, many of them travel across America in search of yet another harvest.
This part of the country has been built on the backs of the Mexican Americans. So you had every bit as much segregation, unequal education, and so forth as the African American did in the Deep South.
The few wealthy landowners were Anglo. The huge majority of the population was locked into a labor pool of reserve labor. Owners of businesses were all Anglos. I don't recall in the downtown area a single Mexican-American business when I was growing up.
In Crystal City, where Jose Angel Gutierrez grew up in the 1940s and 50s, Mexican Americans accounted for 85% of the population, but they had no political representation. For years, Mexican Americans have been denied the right to vote by obstacles like poll taxes, literacy tests, and gerrymandered voting districts.
You take a county where we might be the majority of the population. Well, what the Anglo establishment had done was to divide the county in such a way that it was simply impossible for Mexican Americans to really gain political power. We had the poll tax back then. Most people did not have the money. And if they did, they had the sense not to spend it on the privilege of voting, because it was always white candidates, and that was always the results.
The situation was people were, in many cases, denied the right to vote because they didn't speak English. In other cases, they were in sort of peonage to a boss or patron and were required to vote as he wanted them to. He would pay the poll taxes and they would vote for who he said to vote for. So it was really an archaic system.
We did work very hard. All 5 of us went house to house as
In 1963, for the first time in more than 100 years, Mexican Americans put up their own candidates for office and challenged Anglo politicians for control of city government.
We had to be ingenious and invented cakewalks and tamale sales and dances where you would pay supposedly for the cake or the tamales or the dance, but end up getting registered to vote.
Although only a student, Gutierrez was active in the campaign, making speeches, registering voters, organizing rallies. The 5 candidates known as Los Cinco surprised political observers by defeating the Anglo mayor and the All-Anglo City Council. The victors quickly learned that long-standing traditions do not change easily. First, Texas Ranger A.Y. Alley refused to turn over the keys to City Hall. A phone call from Texas Governor John Conley forced him to accept the new officials. The local business community was more effective in its strategy.
Didn't you lose your job just after the election results were announced? Yes, sir, I sure did. Cut your salary again. It's 16, I'm going to $35 a week. I don't know how long I could stand it, but I'm doing it right now.
They began trying to indict one of the members of the council for a check that had bounced. They tried to remove 1 or 2 others for being late in payments of utilities. And they ran a slate against us the next time around and beat us.
The rise and fall of Los Cinco echoed a long history of conflict between Mexican Americans and the South Texas power structure.
In the history of oppression of Mexicanos, Chicanos in the United States, Texas is probably the worst. You have more of a history of conflict. You have more of a history of land grabbing, outright land grabbing. You have more of a history of just outright physical oppression of the Mexican population in Texas. In fact, in the 20s, the New York Times had an editorial that's saying that the indiscriminate killing of Mexicans in Texas had reached the proportions of being a scandal.
The Texas Rangers were created in 1823 to protect settlers from outlaws. They had a reputation for intimidation and violence toward Mexican Americans.
I was coming up Military Road with Colonel Hickok, and they came to some big mesquite trees, and there was 4 Mexicans hanging by the neck. The colonel says, "Peavy, I guess the Rangers have been through here."
In the face of this frontier justice, terrorized Mexican Americans were reluctant to fight for their civil rights.
Down there, law enforcement was used for private purposes. They were acting as a private police force for some of those farmers down there, employers down in the valley. This is back in 69, 70, somewhere in there. And certainly for the years and years before that, no action was brought against the Rangers. They were just a law unto themselves.
Ranger Alley and the Anglo Council were back in power. It was business as usual in Christie.
I never forgot those kinds of dynamics that go on, and from then on became vigilant that it's not just important to take power. You've got to be able to hold power and govern effectively. So I learned by watching.
Jose Angel Gutierrez went on to graduate school at St. Mary's University in San Antonio. There he met Willie Velazquez. Before long, working together to bring change to Mexican American politics.
We had a regular study circle. We'd read about King and we'd go look for him. We traveled to Atlanta several times. Read about Stokely Carmichael and the snake activists, and we'd track them down. We learned about Corky Gonzalez and Reyes Tijerina, and we'd go find them. Chavez. I mean, we actually read and then went out and got informed firsthand.
Gutierrez wrote his thesis on the conditions for revolution in South Texas.
What he meant by revolution was fundamental change in electoral, economic, and social context. Remember, at this time in South Texas, Mexican Americans were legally barred in many ways from taking part in politics.
Early attempts to organize Mexican Americans began in the 19th century. Some successes came in 1929 with the formation of LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens.
LULAC was very much aware of the oppression which Mexican Americans were experiencing in South Texas. They're very successful in breaking down some discriminatory barriers in the area of education, in the area of employment, in the area of health services.
By the mid-40s, Mexican American servicemen and women returned from World War II, only to find that discrimination was still part of everyday life. These conditions led to the creation of the American GI Forum.
What galvanized the organization was an incident where a returning war hero was refused burial in his own hometown by the Anglo Mortuary Funeral Home.
Felix Longoria from Three Rivers, Texas, died a hero during the liberation of the Philippines.
The idea that a hero could not be buried in his own hometown angered people so much that it really symbolized a lot of the concern, the grievances that these Latino servicemen had.
The GI Forum sent a telegram to then Senator Lyndon Johnson. He intervened, arranging for Longoria to be buried with honors at Arlington National Cemetery. Many Mexican Americans remembered Johnson's support at election time.
I ask your help in this campaign.
In 1960, John F. Kennedy's presidential campaign recognized the potential power of groups like LULAC and the GI Forum and solicited Mexican-American voters.
John F. Kennedy, candidato demócrata a la presidencia, quiere combatir estos males. Es el único candidato que se preocupa.
Kennedy was an extremely popular political figure among Mexican Americans, primarily because he was Catholic, and primarily because he capitalized on that Catholicism by reaching out to the Mexican American population, which was something that prior presidential candidates did not do.
Political activists formed Viva Kennedy clubs throughout the Southwest. Kennedy won Texas by 20,000 votes.
I do not ask you to choose.
The state's Mexican Americans voted for him 10-1. Kennedy's election gave Mexican American political activists a newfound sense of power and raised their expectations, but they were soon disappointed.
Very small crumbs of the political pie passed down to the Mexican American communities. And so there was this disappointment, especially through the 60s, on the part of the Spanish-speaking youth with the Democratic lack of fulfillment of promises and intentions.
Chicano activists, impatient for change, believed they had better strategies for getting political power than those of the previous generation.
There was a great dissatisfaction building within the community, especially among the youth, over the old line organizations like the GI Forum, like LULAC, who had by this point been reduced to social clubs that did a little. They would go out and they would never really protest anything because they didn't want to compromise their dignity.
By 1968, Gutierrez and other students from St. Mary's formed a more militant alternative.
If you can't be an activist, if you can't risk everything, don't bother joining us. Join the GI Forum, join LULAC, because we were looking for people that would go out, take on tactics that were freeway confrontational.
We were convinced that we were the generation that was going to recover the land in the Southwest, not by taking the land, but by taking political control of the institutions in the land.
Bueno, le dice que vine hasta chequear. Ayer me dio el nombre.
José Ángel Gutierrez began organizing the Mexican Americans in the city, determined to win back the government that had been denied Los Cinco.
He was at the right place at the right time. We all needed change, but we weren't quite sure how to go about it.
Gutierrez targeted the schools where young people were fed up with negative stereotypes.
Every time in our history book talked about Mexicanos, it was about the Mexicano bandido, all the bad things that Mexicanos did. And we were seen as lazy. I still remember seeing in the history books the Mexicano with his sombrero over the top and being asleep. And that's what we had to deal with, the image that they had of us there. And that was projected onto us. It was hard to overcome that image that they had.
And then, on the sidelines of high school football, this anger found a common cause.
In these small towns, the whole civic life revolves around high school football. The cheerleaders were always the most popular, the most beautiful, the most whatever to succeed, and so forth.
At Crystal City High School, Mexican Americans outnumbered Anglos 8-1. But school officials would only allow one Mexican American on the cheerleading squad. When Diana Palacios tested that policy, she was rejected by the teachers' committee.
That's when we all really sort of opened our eyes and looked around and realized that all these things had been going on, and we had just kind of sat back and let it happen.
Students threatened to walk out unless given Mexican-American cheerleaders, teachers, and counselors. They also demanded courses in Mexican-American history and something that had long been a sore point, the right to speak Spanish in school.
Which we presented to the school board and would not listen to our demands. I had been caught speaking Spanish, and one of the rules was you do not speak Spanish, not in the halls, not in the recreation or anywhere. And one of the teachers sent me to the principal's office, and I got paddled.
With a boycott imminent, organizers hoped to get parents involved.
We went and asked the men to support us. And of course said no, because if they came, they would kill all these principals and teachers and women. And they said, well, go see the vieja, take the wife. They'll do it. So we took the wife. And the wife was thrown out summarily from the school board. So then we went back to them and said, they threw your wife out, guy. You know, and they're saying your daughter's ugly. She can't be a cheerleader. They only want the pretty ones with the white legs. Now, there's no father who thinks he's got an ugly daughter. The school board insulted them too. So they had no way out. They said, you know, you kids are right. Mama, you're right. I mean, they don't listen to anybody. They won't even listen to us. So you do what you got to do. So the kids started chanting and screaming, walk out, walk out, walk out.
On December 9th, 1969, 700 students walked out of Crystal City High School.
The fact that the Mexican American students walked out over a cheerleading position was very, very significant and took an enormous amount of courage at that time. It went directly to the whole hierarchy down there to try to change that around.
Representatives of the United States Department of Justice intervened to mediate the crisis.
Agreement has been reached between the school board, the parents, and the students. Some of the students have returned to school this afternoon, and it's my understanding that the rest of them will return in the morning.
The school board agreed to all of the demands. 3 months later, Diana Palacios was voted head cheerleader of Crystal City's varsity squad. Building on this success, Mexican Americans in Crystal City created their own political party, La Raza Unida, the United People.
We no longer accept the fact that we are powerless and be complaining about our powerlessness. We know we're powerful. We know we can be organized. We know we can triumph. We know that our destiny is not tied to holes in the fields, but tied to much greater and loftier goals and levels, if we would only take the step in that direction. La Raza Unida is an example of this kind of step.
It was very clear.
All right, let me close that out real quick. Okay. Okay, so that covers some of the information. It actually jumps ahead a little bit, but we're going to come back and cover some of the information that's on the PowerPoint that's mentioned in that video. Let me go back and make sure I've got my PowerPoint back in front of me. In fact, I just spoke to Jose Angel Gutierrez about 2 months ago at an event. I've met him, I think, 3 times. Actually, let's see. Let me get this PowerPoint in front of me real quick, and then I'll make sure we're in the right place. Oh, almost there. Okay, so we have the creation of the American GI Forum. Just for fun, let me do this real quick. Let's see. There's a picture of me with Jose Angel Gutierrez back about 2 months ago at an event at the Rosemarine Theater. I know a few of you actually came to an event with me at the Rosemarine Theater back in January. It was just a few months after that. For those who are looking at YouTube, that's Jose Angel and me at that function. So let's go back over. So we have the American GI Forum. Of course, that was established in 1948 by Hector P. Garcia. Garcia was a medical doctor who was in the United States Army during World War II. He establishes the American GI Forum really as a civil rights organization for Mexican Americans. He establishes that, I think in Corpus Christi, Texas, too, if I'm not mistaken. I might be off on that, but I'm pretty sure it's in Corpus also. Again, they gained fame and power representing Felix Longoria. Longoria was discussed in that video. Of course, Longoria died in liberation of the Philippines. It comes back to Three Rivers, Texas. Three Rivers, Texas is about halfway between Corpus Christi and San Antonio. It's a very small town. I think may have a little less than 2,000 people. If you ever drive through there, there's probably like 1 or 2 stoplights. So it's not a very big town. But when Longoria comes back, of course, the funeral home director refuses to allow services. Even if you went to the cemetery back in those days, the funeral plots where the people were buried was segregated. You had white people buried here, Mexican people buried here, and you had barbed wire in between. So they segregated the burial grounds also to keep the Mexicans and the white people separated even after death, right? So that's going to be the Longoria affair. Lyndon B. Johnson, of course, is mentioned here. We'll come back to him. Comes to civil rights issues, he will be much more significant than John F. Kennedy. As the video just mentioned, Kennedy's going to be a bit of a disappointment, and I think I'm going to mention that again in just a minute. Now we'll move on to the Hernandez versus Texas case in 1954. This will involve a man named Pete Hernandez. Hernandez worked as a migrant farmer, picked cotton mainly. This would happen in Edna, Texas. Edna, Texas is about halfway between Houston and Corpus Christi. So it's kind of southeast Texas. Pete Hernandez in 1950 got in a fight with a guy at a bar. He gets kicked out of the bar. After he's kicked out of the bar, he goes home, grabs a gun, comes back to the bar, and shoots the guy named Joe Espinosa. So he kills a guy. There's no doubt about that. All the facts of the case show that, yes, Pete Hernandez did, in fact, kill Joe Espinosa. So Hernandez is then put on trial in Jackson County. He is found guilty. The lawyer who represents him is a guy named Gus Garcia. I'm pretty sure, I think, Gus Garcia is on the study guide. I don't have his name here, but Gus Garcia will show in just a minute. So Hernandez is represented by Gus Garcia. At the court case, as a result of the case, of course, Hernandez was found guilty, but Garcia appealed the decision. The reason he appealed the decision was because he had an all-white jury. Now, Garcia worked with both LULAC and the American GI Forum. So the American GI Forum and LULAC both had lawyers who were helping out Gus Garcia. Now, I'm going to show this image next. Garcia, the way, of course, you see Hector Garcia. Hector Garcia is over here to the left. The middle guy is a guy named George I. Sanchez. If you follow Mexican-American history, there's 2 different George Sanchez's that are pretty significant. George I. Sanchez is this guy. And then over to the right is Gus, or Gustavo Garcia. Gus Garcia, as you can see on the right side, is a pretty fair-complected guy. That's going to come into the conversation in just a moment. So the reason Garcia appeals this decision to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals is because when the trial was held, it was an all-white jury. And if you look back on the records, there hadn't been a juror with a Spanish surname in at least 25 years. Now, Jackson County, Texas was probably around 20% Hispanic. But for 25 straight years at least, not a single Hispanic juror had served in Jackson County. So Gus Garcia is basically saying that every trial in Jackson County is likely to lead to guilty verdicts against Mexican people if you have a population in Jackson County that's against the Mexican people altogether, right? So he takes this to the court of Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. He loses there, but then he appeals to the United States Supreme Court. Now, the reason I mentioned that race issue and mentioned that he's a little bit lighter complected is because while he was defending Hernandez in the Jackson County courthouse, of course, he's making this point that Mexicans should be identified separately than white people. Of course, the state of Texas is saying that the fact that there's been no Hispanics serving any jurors over the past 25 years is simply a coincidence. Yeah, that's what Texas is saying. It's just a coincidence that no Hispanic jurors have served over the past 25 years. Garcia is saying, well, it's pretty evident that they are keeping Hispanics from serving on juries. And of course, Texas is arguing, well, there's no difference between a white person and an Anglo-white person and a Mexican-American white person. Legally, they're the same person. Well, Gus Garcia, during an intermission during the trial, has to go to the restroom. When he goes to the restroom, he's about to walk into the white restroom when somebody at the courthouse told him, no, you can't go to that restroom. That restroom is for white people only. You have to go to another restroom. So Gus Garcia goes downstairs outside the building, and he sees a door, and the sign on the door, make sure I give this to you correctly. The sign on the door read, "Colored men and hombres aquí." So basically, the restroom for African Americans was also designated for Mexican Americans, even though legally Mexicans were white. So he's going to use that during the trials as we go through the appeals process and the United States Supreme Court. In the United States Supreme Court, Garcia's most famous quote is as follows. He says, quote, "My people were in Texas 100 years before Sam Houston that went back from Tennessee," end quote. What he's pointing out is that Sam Houston was actually an illegal immigrant. If you know Texas history, you know that Mexico, which had control of Texas up until 1836, banned American immigration in 1829, 1830. So any Americans that came after 1830 were illegal immigrants, and Sam Houston came after 1830. Gus Garcia uses this argument, and he winds up winning the court case. So in this court decision, this would be significant for basically anybody with an identifiable ethnic background. So this will give protections to people based upon ethnicity, as opposed to just race, because again, Mexican Americans were considered white racially. So now we're going to look at ethnicity too. So this will kind of set the stage for future cases going forward. This will give 14th Amendment protection to people of Mexican descent, despite the fact that Mexican people were considered white. So make sure you know that Hernandez versus Texas case. Make sure you're familiar with Gus Garcia. And then we'll go over to these Viva Kennedy campaigns. Again, this was also mentioned in the video. John F. Kennedy, we'll talk about Kennedy next class period as we get into the Vietnam era. John F. Kennedy campaigned heavily in the Mexican American, the Latin American community. As you saw from the video, he had his wife even speak Spanish in ads to promote his candidacy. One of the guys that was leading the charge for Kennedy in Texas was a guy named Henry B. Gonzalez. We'll say a little bit about Henry B. And forgive me, I do call him Henry B. because I grew up in San Antonio, and Henry B. Gonzalez is always referred to as Henry B. And if you're from San Antonio. So Henry B. Was first of all elected to the San Antonio City Council in 1953. That made Henry B. Gonzalez the first Mexican American elected to the San Antonio City Council. So that's going to be his first big triumph, is winning that council seat. In 1956, Henry B. Gonzalez then was elected to the Texas State Senate. He was the first Mexican-American Texas State Senator in over 110 years. So definitely the first of the 20th century. So Henry B. Gonzalez also became the first Mexican-American state senator in over 110 years. Now, in that first term in office in 1957, he led the longest filibuster in Texas history up to that point. Essentially, the Texas legislature was trying to pass legislation that would hurt the Brown v. Board of Education decision from 1954 that was extended in 55. So he leads a 36-hour filibuster. If you don't know what a filibuster is, basically what you do is you take the stage at the Texas Senate or House, and you just speak nonstop. And as long as you're speaking, they can't stop you. And if you keep speaking beyond the time that they're supposed to vote on legislation, then you can keep that legislation from being passed. I have help. Another guy's going to help him out. Don't worry about the other guy's name, but that 36 hours was a tremendously long filibuster. Right, a few years ago, Wendy Davis made big news for filibustering. Her filibuster was like 11 hours. So, that was nothing compared to the 36 hours that Henry B. Completes in 1957. Now, the success of that filibuster is that because of the filibuster, 8 of 10 bills that were geared towards beating Brown v. Board of Education in Texas, or hurting it anyways, 8 of those 10 bills were killed. They didn't have time to vote on them. So that was a very successful filibuster. So Henry B. is starting to rise up the ranks as this very important political figure in Texas. Of course, he will help lead these Viva Kennedy campaigns in 1960 while he's still a Texas state senator. And he's hoping to gain a higher position in government. John F. Kennedy is making all these promises to Latin Americans and African Americans about how much power he's going to give them and how much support he's going to give to them. So African Americans and Mexican Americans will help Kennedy win in 1960. But after Kennedy takes office, Kennedy really doesn't do very much to help the African Americans or Mexican Americans. When Martin Luther King Jr. and civil rights activists in the South are protesting, he's going to give very little support and oftentimes kind of ignore the issues. He's wind up really doing much to help Mexican Americans in the Southwest either. So Kennedy winds up being a bit of a disappointment to Mexican American political leaders. The Democratic Party and Kennedy supported Henry B. Gonzalez in 1961, and in 1961, Henry B. Gonzalez won a seat in the United States House of Representatives, which made Henry B. Gonzalez the first Mexican-American U.S. rep in Texas history. So Henry B. Gonzalez is then your first Mexican-American U.S. rep in Texas history. Now, Henry B. was criticized, as the video mentioned. Henry B. Gonzalez, as we go into the mid to late 60s, he's seen by these younger, more progressive civil rights proponents. He's seen as a kind of guy that just has become part of the party platform and really doesn't do that much. Kind of a Washington insider, right? So the younger generation that's coming up in the 60s isn't going to really like Henry B. Gonzalez all that much as we get into the mid to late 60s. So we'll come back to that in a little bit. We'll mention real quick the United Farm Workers that rise up in 1962. This has roots with a guy named Fred Ross Sr. Fred Ross Sr. Founded or established an organization called the Community Service Organization. I think that may be on the study guide. Community Service Organization, CSO. The Community Service Organization fought primarily for Mexican-American rights, especially in labor and in politics to some extent, in the beginning in the 1940s. So 1947, Fred Ross Sr. creates this community service organization mainly to help Mexican Americans in California, and then spread out a little bit. And 2 of the people that joined his organization were named Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. Dolores Huerta over here on the left, your left if you're looking at this, Cesar Chavez over to the right. So both of these individuals were in the CSO. They branch on their own, and they focus their work on migrant farmers and labor representation in the late 50s and into the 60s. They will create the organization called the UFW, United Farm Workers. Both of these people will have just as much to say in how successful this organization is as the other. If you studied any Mexican American history before college or before today's class, or anything before the semester, or during this semester, you would have probably heard Cesar Chavez, right? Chavez is the one guy that I remember as a kid reading the name about, reading his name in the history book. I think there might have been like this much written about Cesar Chavez, leading migrant laborers in California primarily and across the Southwest. He and Huerta, along with the United Farm Workers, will lead something called the Delano Grape Strike between 1965 and 1970. Basically, they're trying to get these big farmers to give better wages, safer conditions, better benefits to farm workers in California, especially migrant farm workers. They will represent both Filipinos and Mexican migrant laborers, and they will wind up being successful. So after 1970, you will see farmers negotiate new contracts with the UFW. We will see safer conditions, better pay. They'll give these migrant farm workers the ability to get some of these really poisonous and dangerous chemicals out of the fields and stuff like that, right? So the UFW will wind up being very successful. Chavez kind of gets the limelight, right? He's on camera whenever they're speaking. He's the one portrayed speaking, but kind of like Martin Luther King Jr., right? When I talk about African-American civil rights, I kind of de-emphasize Martin Luther King Jr. a bit because really it's I give a lot of credit to the workers, the people sacrificing themselves that are coming up in mass groups, and then Martin Luther King Jr. will kind of come down and bring the cameras. You're going to see some of that with Cesar Chavez too, right? Chavez brings the cameras in. He's the guy that's pretty well known. But Huerta is probably doing more work than Chavez is, right? Huerta's traveling all over the country. I think she might have gone around the world, raising money, raising awareness, recruiting people. Huerta was very, very significant. Huerta is still around today. She actually spoke at the University of North Texas just a year or two ago at an event. She is still campaigning. She is still working, and she's probably, her mid-80s by now, maybe older. Both of them were born in the United States. Cesar Chavez was originally from Arizona, so these are not Mexican immigrants. These are Mexican Americans who were born in the United States, so they are citizens. I could talk more about them, but I'm going to run out of time if I do, so I don't want to. So we'll stop there. We'll move on to this more militant movement. So when we get to the mid-1960s, we're going to see more of a brown power movement. I mentioned that we had that Civil Rights Act of 1964 that will protect people based upon the color of their skin. And I mentioned before that that's when you kind of see Mexican Americans stop arguing so much for rights based upon their whiteness, and they start arguing more for rights based upon their brownness, right? Trying to get protections based upon minority status. So as we go through the 60s, 70s, and early 80s, we're going to see court case after case in which Mexican Americans are going to be fighting for recognition as being people of color. Of course, a lot of African-American political leaders, civil rights leaders, political leaders aren't going to like that very much because before 1964, Mexican-Americans oftentimes worked against African-Americans, basically saying we deserve rights that they don't deserve. And after 1964, you'll see Mexican-American civil rights activists say we deserve rights just like the African-American people do, right? So you're going to see this tension rise up between African-American and Mexican-American civil rights and politicals quite often after this. Now, we'll mention this guy, Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez. Corky Gonzalez, let me see, I think I've got him over here. Well, is the guy over to the right in the black, wearing all black, and he's also the guy up here in the top left. Corky Gonzalez, before he became this kind of political and civil rights leader, was a professional boxer, and he was a very good professional boxer. In fact, as a featherweight boxer in the 1940s and 50s, he fought professionally for about 9 years. He had over 60 career wins. I think his record was something like 63-11, somewhere around there. At one point, he was ranked number 3 in the world in his weight class. So he wasn't just a boxer, he was one of the best boxers in the world. Never had a shot at the title, but he was very highly acclaimed, a very, very good boxer. In addition to that, Corky Gonzalez was an outstanding poet. If we were in the classroom, I might actually distribute some of these, but he wrote a poem called I Am Joaquin, or Yo Soy Joaquin. That poem, Yo Soy Joaquin, or I Am Joaquin, it's a bilingual poem that kind of describes being Mexican-American and this dual identity of being both Mexican and American in the United States in the Southwest. It's a fairly lengthy poem. Any of you could Google Yo Soy Joaquin or I Am Joaquin, and you'd be able to find that poem pretty easily, pretty quickly. But he's going to write that, and he'll establish this group, Crusade for Justice, around 1966-67 timeframe. They're going to be pushing for civil rights for people of Mexican descent, especially in the field of education, right? Kind of like that video showed. Schools tend to be segregated, and then a lot of times Mexican kids at white schools aren't taught as well or treated as well as some of the white students. There's expectations set forth for Mexicans that basically this idea that you're going to be a blue-collar worker or farmer your whole life, so there's no reason to give you an education to make you a doctor, lawyer, engineer, architect, anything like that. So we're going to be fighting for educational rights. He is also going to be fighting to kind of grab on to cultural tradition, this brown pride that we kind of saw with African Americans in the 1920s, where we saw this black pride, or black is beautiful, black power, as we go in the 1960s. Right, Corky Gonzalez is basically doing that in the 1960s and early 70s with his organization Crusade for Justice, and that organization was in Denver, Colorado. Make sure you know that Crusade for Justice was in Denver, Colorado. That's where Gonzalez was from. He was originally from Denver. Now, Denver has a very significant Mexican-American population. Even today, I believe Denver's probably around 30, 35%. I think it's around 30% Mexican-American, maybe a little higher. And it's been there for a long time because a lot of Mexican migrant farmers moved to Colorado in the 1920s and 30s. And I can go on for this for quite a bit, but basically they're going to be picking a lot of sugar beets. Right? There's all these sugar beet fields out there. So you're going to see a substantial Mexican population in Colorado early in the 20th century. Denver and Chicago would be two of the main cities they go to outside of this traditional Southwest. So he leads this organization. We're going to come back to him again in just a minute. So that's created just before Mayo. Mayo was mentioned in the video we just watched. A Mexican-American youth organization established in 1967. It was founded by 5 St. Mary's University students. Three of them are listed here: Willie Velasquez, Jose Angel Gutierrez, and Mario Compian. So if we go back to this image over here, you'll see Willie Velasquez over here in the bottom left. You'll see over here with his arm up on the left side, that's going to be Jose Angel Gutierrez. Gutierrez mentioned Reyes Tijerina. You don't have to worry about Tijerina for this class. Now keep in mind, next school year, I am scheduled to teach Mexican-American history first half and second half. So in the fall, I'll be teaching first half. Next spring, I'll be teaching second half. Mexican-American history does substitute for U.S. history. So 2 U.S. history credits. You could always take a Mexican-American history class in lieu of the other U.S. history class. But that's Reyes Tijerina. Basically, he's going to be all about taking back land for people of Mexican and Native American descent who had their land taken by white people, mainly New Mexico, Texas too, mainly New Mexico. But don't worry about Tijerina so much right now. So Willie Velasquez, Jose Angel Gutierrez, and Mario Compian were going to be 3 of the leading members of Mayo in the late 60s. Again, they lead that Crystal City walkout. You guys just watched the video about that. That's going to be building on another walkout that we'll talk about in just a little bit. Now, as we go forward, Velasquez is going to kind of leave the organization once we move to a political party. We'll come back to that in a minute. Now in 1969, okay, so, well, I'm sorry, before I do that. So make sure you know that we have Crusade for Justice in Denver, Colorado. We have Mayo in San Antonio, Texas. And we're going to, before we go on to California, we're going to mention this National Chicano Youth Liberation Conference. This was in Denver, Colorado. If it's in Denver, Colorado in 1969, you know that the guy that's going to be pushing for this is Corky Gonzalez. So Corky Gonzalez and his cohorts, lead this Youth Liberation Conference. 1,500 young Mexican Americans converged from around the country. It's not just from Colorado, people from California, Illinois, Wisconsin, Texas, right? All over the country. They're going to Denver, Colorado in 1969. Gonzalez comes up with something called the Plan Espiritual de Aztlán that he produces, basically pushing for more self-determination. He's pushing for better housing, education, businesses, stuff like that when we're at this Youth Liberation Conference. And this will inspire a lot of the youth to become more actively involved in pushing for political, economic, and social power. Now, right after that conference, many of the people who went to that conference go back to Santa Barbara, California, and they create another organization, Movimiento Estudiantil Chicanx de Aztlán, or Chicano, actually originally, but now it's Chicano. Well, I say now. I'm not sure what their name is now. Last year, leaders voted to change their name to MEPA, and I'll mention that again in just a minute. But originally, it's Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano de Aztlán, established in 1969. So this is going to be another organization. Now we have one in California. We have the major organization in Colorado. We have one in South Texas, and we have one now in this Los Angeles area. So this organization is going to try to tie all of these people of Mexican descent together with a more encompassing organization. Again, this is going to focus mainly on college students, kind of like those African American civil rights movements of the 60s where they're focusing on the youth. That's what Mecha, Mayo, and Crusade are all doing. Now, Mecha is building also, in addition to that Youth Liberation Conference, they're building on these East LA walkouts, see what they call the blowouts. These started in March of 1968. So in March of 1968, we're going to see the walkout of high school students in East Los Angeles. East Los Angeles is the historic Mexican-American part of Los Angeles. Around 15,000, maybe up to 20,000 students all walked out of their high schools in protest of conditions for Mexican-American students in the late 1960s. They are pushing for some of the issues that you already heard about from that video, right? Look at Mexican-American history, allow students to study Spanish, bring in better teachers. Now, all these different things that they're looking for that show to them that the teachers and the districts really care about them as students and individuals. Now, just to give you an example of how some of the teachers viewed them, I have a quote from a teacher at Lincoln High School. He said the following. So this will be a quote from this teacher named Richard Davis. He said, quote, "Most of the Mexican Americans have never had it so good. Before the Spanish came, he was an Indian grubbing in the soil, and after the Spanish came, he was a slave. It seems to me that America must be a very desirable place. Witness the number of wetbacks and migrants, both legal and illegal, from Mexico. When it comes to going to school, the Mexican American is passive. Absenteeism is the Mexican's culture. It's his way of life. Always mañana. Maybe he'll get an education mañana. When it comes to repairing his home, controlling childbirth, planning for tomorrow, he is passive." End quote. Now, a couple of times I used the word Mexican when he actually said he, but I'm basically pointing out that this teacher, and I'm sure there's other teachers like him, kind of viewed Mexicans as just being lazy people who weren't ever going to do anything with their life because they're basically not motivated to do anything with their life, right? So that's part of the movement. The reason for this movement is to try to get teachers like that out and bring in more teachers that are going to be receptive to them as students and as individuals. So they're pushing for more basically Mexican-American teachers, administrators, stuff like that. Now I think I have something from my dissertation maybe. Let me see, there it is. Now again, I do specialize in Mexican-American history. This is actually from my dissertation, just to kind of give an example of what it was like here, like in the Fort Worth area. Now, this is the Fort Worth ISD 72-73 school year. So just after this, if you see on the left-hand column, you'll see the number of Mexican students in each of these schools. These are the schools that had the highest numbers of Mexican students in Fort Worth. You'll see in that column over here, you'll see the number of Mexican teachers. So you can see most of these schools don't have any Mexican teachers. In fact, these bottom 4 schools didn't have any Mexicans at all. These are all black schools, but they did have some Mexican teachers. So basically, you're going to see a similar push here in Fort Worth and other school districts around the country, where you're looking for better representation within the schools themselves to provide a better environment, more conducive environment for the education process for people of Mexican descent. So Mecha, Mayo, and Crusade, right? All these members are then going to converge, and they're going to create La Raza Unida Party. They just had their 50-year anniversary. The reason I met with Jose Angel Gutierrez and others back in February was because it was a 50-year anniversary of La Raza Unida Party. So this party was created in 1970. The leader, the chair of the party, would be Jose Angel Gutierrez. It came on to a vote between Gutierrez and Corky Gonzalez, and Gutierrez wound up winning the election. So they're going to run as a third party. In Texas, they will nominate this guy over here, Ramsey Muñiz. Ramsey Muñiz was a college football star at Baylor. I think he might have been a lawyer, if I'm not mistaken. He runs a very active, energetic campaign, travels all over the state. And he winds up taking over 200,000 votes in 2 separate gubernatorial elections. Almost forces a runoff. And this is a time when Democratic candidates won every year. For like 100 years, Texas had a Democratic governor, and he almost forced a runoff in one of those elections. So Muñiz would be the candidate. So make sure you know who Ramsey Muñiz is, because his name may come up again either on a quiz or an exam later on. By the way, just one more anecdote. Ramsey, in the early 1980s, had legal trouble. He's been in trouble a few times for drug trafficking. He was just released from prison last year. So he's spent most of the past 35 to 40 years in prison on various occasions, mainly because of drug issues. But he is out now, if he's still alive. I think he's still alive. All right, and then we'll move on to MALDEF. So now we have a more organized movement. Now, La Raza Unida Party will die off. One thing I want to say about that is that La Raza Unida Party will have long-reaching effects because it does mobilize Mexican Americans in the 1970s. So people that will run for office later on, after 78 and going forward, a lot of them are going to have ties to La Raza Unida Party. In fact, Fort Worth's first Fort Worth ISD's first Mexican-American school board member was a guy named Carlos Puente. Puente was the chair of the La Raza Unida Tarrant County, rather. He also served on the Fort Worth City Council. Then there's, of course, one of the main participants in the La Raza Unida Party was a woman named Rosie Castro. Rosie Castro has twin sons, Joaquin and Julian. Julian, you may recall, just ran for president this year. Joaquin is a is a U.S. rep, and he represents the same district that Henry B. Gonzalez represented up until 1998, 97 or 98. So both of her sons are actively involved in the Democratic Party, but their roots, again, are going to be in La Raza Unida Party. MALDEF, we'll just mention, I think that's going to be the last thing we're covering. Oh, actually, let me do this. La Raza Unida Party did kind of try to tie everybody together with this idea of Aztlan. Aztlan is the ancient home of the Aztec people. So the idea is that, you know, the Aztec people in the southwestern United States went down to Mexico, created a city called Tenochtitlan. They were conquered by the Spanish, and this idea says that the Aztec people basically are coming back to their homeland. So when Mexicans come back to the United States, they are reclaiming the land where they used to have power before they went to establish Tenochtitlan. So that's going to kind of tie a lot of these people together. That's why they have that Mecha organization using the term Aztlan. Aztlan will be used by Corky Gonzalez too. And we'll close out with MALDEF. So in 1968, in the midst of this Chicano movement, the Mexican-American Legal Defense and Educational Fund was created. So LULAC is going to start backing off on court cases. MALDEF will kind of take over beginning in 68. Their big case that we'll mention here is White versus Register. White versus Register will basically force a lot of cities to go to single-member districts. So just to put it this way, if a city is, let's say, 30% Mexican-American and let's say 10% black and 60% white, and you don't have single-member districts, there's a pretty good chance that all city councilmen are going to be white if everybody's voting across the county or city, right? The idea is to give more power to minority communities, whether they be Mexican-American, black, or any other minority community. You will create single-member districts. That way, different communities in different parts of the cities will have representation that's based upon their own personal background. So that starts in the 70s, thanks in large part to this White v. Register case in 1973 that was argued by MALDEF. And I said that was the last thing. I'm sure I mentioned one other thing because, again, this could come up on a quiz. I alluded to this earlier, but in the late 1960s, or when we get to 1970, when we have that La Raza Unida Party established, Willie Velazquez is not going to go that direction. He doesn't think the third party is going to be effective. Of course, it dies out within a decade. So what he's going to do is he's going to go out and create his own organization called the Southwest Voter Registration Education Project, SVREP. That organization is on the study guide, so I want to make sure to mention that. SVREP, so the Southwest Voter Registration Education Program. That organization was it's still around, intent on registering voters and educating voters on the education process. So you're going to see hundreds of thousands and probably eventually millions of people register to vote through SVREP, which was established by Willie Velazquez in the early 1970s. So we'll go ahead and end there today. That'll cover our Mexican-American civil rights lecture. Again, next class will be our 5th and final quiz, so make sure you're ready for that. Go through the study guide. Again, that may be the most difficult quiz of the semester. Lots of terms, lots of organizations, lots of people you're going to want to know. So go through that, make sure you're familiar with it, and you'll have the quiz next class period. If you have any questions, let me know. Shoot me an email, whatever you need to do, and I'll see you guys later. Take care. Bye.